with Zoom with Czarny. I'm Dustin Czarny. Welcome to my interview show. I'm the Democratic Elections Commissioner for Onondaga County, and this is a show that I interviewed democracy advocates as well as candidates for the upcoming elections. This week, I have my good friend Susan Lerner. We actually recorded this a couple of weeks ago. She's from Common Cause New York and a great advocate for democracy across the state. We talked about her hopes for the upcoming legislative session for Albany for the New York State Legislature. So we talked a little bit about that. So please stay for the interview. As I said, I've been running a little bit behind on a lot of my content in the month of January. That's because I've been traveling so much, going back and forth to DC and Albany for my convention, as well as we've had a little bit of changeover at the Board of Elections to get ready for 2024. And so I've been a little busy on that, but I'm hoping to get back on schedule this week. We are finding out shortly about the presidential primary. We know that there are at least 3 candidates for the Democrats, and there could be, multiple candidates for the Republicans. See my commissioner in the car last week about that and why we still don't know who the candidates are, because several of them have dropped off, but not actually sent in their paperwork, and several of them could drop off by February 6th. So look at my last commissioner in the car about that and go over that, but we're still waiting to hear whether any of the Democratic candidates will go forward besides Joe Biden. There's a February 3rd South Carolina primary that might loosen that up in the sense that some of the 2 candidates, Dean Phillips and Marianne Williamson, have already talked about, I think Marianne Williamson in a Zoom call says she might be suspending her campaign, but now she denies that. Dean Phillips says he's at least going on to South Carolina. So we'll have to see how that happened. But he did lose the primary in New Hampshire to a write-in candidacy of Joe Biden. And again, all of that is explained in the commissioner in the car. But Nikki Haley is the sole Republican actively campaigning against Donald Trump on the Republican side. But many have filed to be on the New York ballot and yet have filed paperwork to come off that ballot. Again, February 6th is that deadline. The thing with Nikki Haley is that she says she's staying on to the South Carolina primary, which is later in the month. It's later in February for the Republicans, and thus she could miss that February 6th window to come off the ballot in New York, thus requiring us to actually still hold that primary. So we're gonna see how that goes over the next couple of weeks. Check my commissioner in car. I'll be keeping you up to date on all of that, on those inner workings. But for now, stay tuned for my interview with Susan Lerner of Common Cause New York, and are talking about how we can make our New York democracy better this coming session. Bye-bye. And I'm back, and I'm happy to have my good friend Susan Lerner of Common Cause New York coming back on Zoom with Czarny on our annual check-in to talk about what Common Cause is doing on legislation for election law and all the other things that Common Cause does. Susan, thank you so much for coming on the program again.
Dustin, you are my favorite election wonk to talk with, no question.
Well, we've talked many times, but there may be people that are viewing this that haven't watched this before. So, Susan, can you kind of tell us about what Common Cause is and what your role is?
Yeah.
Common Cause.
So Common Cause is what's called a good government group, a government watchdog. We were founded in the 70s by a Republican, James Gardner, who served in Lyndon Johnson's cabinet. And our role is to be the voice of the people in the halls of power, is to help citizens and residents of our state understand our system and to have a more active voice in all of the matters that impact democracy. We see our role as helping to strengthen and develop a fair and inclusive democracy, and everything that's involved in that includes campaign finance, redistricting, and here in New York, in particular, over the last several years, voting rights and election reform, as well as ethics and anti-corruption.
Which is pretty much everything that we talk about here on this program.
Exactly. That's why you and I have such a good time. We're
That's right.
complete overlap.
That's right. That's complete overlap. And you've been an ally of election administration. Sometimes we disagree on bills, but you've always agreed that we are, trying to make our democracy better in New York. So I thank you for that. But when this airs, we're on the legislative session for New York has opened.
Mhm.
It's in swing, and on these even year legislative sessions, they like to try to wrap up early June.
Yeah.
But that's still 5 good months of legislating, and I know Common Cause is always very active. So what are you looking for from the New York State Legislature this year?
So in sort of priority order, chronological order, we're really interested in a couple of pretty chewy, pretty large measures that would help protect election integrity in this really challenging 2024 election cycle. And that means that we're advocating for a bill that's been introduced that would require candidates to file a statement under penalty of perjury very early on in the campaign, providing basic information about their background. Where do they live? Were they in the service? If they were in the service, what was their service record? Their employment record for the last 5 years. And if they are making representations about their educational background, something about their educational background. And the idea is that information would be public, and voters, the press, opposition candidates, anybody who's interested would then be able to see, are these true statements? We don't ever want to have a situation where the voter feels that they're being lied to as part of the campaign and that that's acceptable. So it's a strong public policy statement that candidates have to be truthful. And look, Dustin, most candidates are. We've had some very notable exceptions, but they're the exception. So this is a positive statement. This is what we expect. We're working on a bill that would also go towards integrity issues, which is placing disclosures on any campaign ads that are false, where the image has been manipulated in some way, or there's the actual words that are spoken were never spoken by the person whose voice you hear, what are called deep fakes, that we now have the technology to copy anything and make it seem like somebody did something they actually didn't. So if there's a campaign ad along those lines, that there's a disclosure. And if a campaign goes out without the disclosure, and the person who is victimized by that ad would be able to go into court and stop it. We want the voters to know that our elections are being run honestly. And that's one of the reasons why we're also big fans of providing sufficient money in the budget for election administration.
Here, here. Yes.
Because people need to know there are sufficient resources to adequately staff our polls, to train our people, to be sure that the equipment is running correctly, because we actually have all of those things when we have the resources to do the job that I know you do so well in Onondaga, but I know you're challenged on your budget, and many counties don't take our elections seriously enough. And I admit we're guilty. Us reformers, we have gotten the legislature to pass a lot of changes in election law over the last 5 years. And not all of them have come with the financial backing that the counties need to do what they're now being told to do. So it's a very pro-voter atmosphere. It's a very pro-voter attitude to say that the state, which sets the rules for our elections, ought to help pay for them. In most states, the state either pays the entire cost of an election where there's any state office on the ballot, or they reimburse the counties for some portion of the cost. New York's an outlier. We foist all the costs on the counties. That's not really fair. And so we're big advocates for a annual budget line to make a significant dent in the cost of improving our elections so that everybody can feel confident that they're being well run. And then lastly, we're looking for a process where volunteers from organizations like Common Cause and our election protection program, or from the NAACP, or other civically minded organizations with a track record of helping voters are recognized as monitors for our elections, so that the volunteers get properly trained, they're identified as volunteers, so they can go into election locations and observe what's going on. Just to clarify, who's in there and how are they actually helping?
Yeah, let's talk about those pieces of legislation because I think they're all very interesting. The first one, with the requiring of the candidate information that is posted on the Board of Elections websites. Of course, some boards of elections are gonna chafe at that, but I think it's a good idea, and especially with the death of local news,
Yeah,
and there's you know the there not only are there less papers, but there's less reporters at the papers that are left, and covering local elections is tough, and so then you're relying on candidate websites and candidate
yeah,
stuff provided stuff, and though this would still be candidate provided information, it would be hosted on a trusted source website. So I find that very interesting.
mhm,
And yes, most of the candidates are accurate, but it's not just about being accurate, it's about being able to get the information out to the mass public
right, right.
as
You know,
well, right?
we spent a lot of time trying to figure out what we could do, right? We can't create new qualifications for getting onto the ballot, but we can require a statement under penalty of perjury. It's, the only thing that if you don't file it, you could be subject to financial penalties. And of course, the public's notified that you didn't bother to file that statement. If you lie on the statement, it's a statement under penalty of perjury, and the Board of Elections can refer it to the DA, who then decides this is a serious enough matter that we want to take some action. So there are some teeth to it, but it doesn't keep anybody off the ballot. It's designed to provide the voter with the information they need to make an informed decision between candidates. That's what elections are about, right? Providing the voters with enough information to make a choice. We trust voters to
Right.
choose. We have to give them the information to be informed.
I think it can help the local media too, because it would be a starting point for
Right.
them as well to start their coverage. You talked about funding boards of elections. And people who've been following this program, I've been an advocate of that as well, and having structural reforms at the county level, because we have a lot of counties that are just not
Yeah.
uh, they're not pointing up the people that are needed. And I bristle a little bit at, like, yes, there are some reforms that were passed, but our constitution says that this is a county government function. We're not an unfunded mandate. We're a responsibility. And so, in many counties fund their boards well,
Yeah.
and give them the resources to do the job. But the counties that don't, I've always felt like they need some kind of structure in place to say this is the minimum that we expect you to do to meet the needs of the voters. So you're not having this, one county does all of this stuff and then the other county doesn't, and people are expecting these services, or the ability to process their voter registration on time, that kind of stuff. So but it sounds like you're more advocating like a line item in the budget each year that would offset some county costs. Are you worried at all that the counties would then just use that money to cut the budgets even more? That's what I get a little worried about.
Well, yeah, we're kind of between a rock and a hard place, right? It could be that the annual budget line is specifically directed to a cost that is difficult for the counties to fund. Maybe it's capital improvements of some kind. Maybe it's extra mailing costs for more communications to the voters, and that it doesn't go for general operating. I think there are ways to handle that in the budget to make it clear that this is not alleviating the county's responsibility. But in states that do this, the counties do provide a portion, but the balance is made up by the state. To me, it's such a strong public policy statement. It's a message to the counties. Don't mess around with this. This is a basic government function. We recognize our responsibility at the state to help, but you also have a responsibility, as you point out under the state constitution, that you have to meet as well. So I think it's a positive, not a, hey, you don't bother. We're taking it up. It's we're in this together.
Yeah, I hope so too. I mean, obviously anything will help. And I do think structural reforms about staffing levels need to be put into place like we do in
Yes,
health departments and other departments that have traditionally been underfunded by counties because they're not seen as a valuable piece for reelection or whatever.
right,
I mean,
right.
it's or it's not an $85 million aquarium or something like that.
You
So
know,
it's
but I can't tell you how many times in the last 4 years or 6 years, actually, I've heard from people where they've said, before 2016, I didn't pay any attention to elections. I just figured somebody else was taking care of it and it was all okay. And now I think people are aware of the fact that elections are not something that you just take for granted. A democracy is something we protect. And when we protect something in a capitalist society, we fund it, we provide the money for it.
yeah, it needs to be higher on the list of priorities
Correct.
than it usually is.
Yeah.
And your uh well, the last bill, I'm sorry, I'm trying to remember. You
I
had
have
so
so
many there.
many.
Oh, what's that?
I have so many.
Oh, you
That's
do.
my problem. My
Oh,
staff
the
yells at me.
poll watcher bill.
Poll
That is
monitors.
something that I think is very important because we have all these organizations out there, and that right now I don't think people realize to be a poll watcher in New York, you have to be authorized by a recognized party.
Right.
And the Board of Elections cannot authorize anybody besides our election inspectors. And
Right.
this has created a conflict where good government groups are sending people, but also nefarious people have sent people as well. And having a regulation in place will allow the good government groups to have an access that to be a poll watcher. And again, they can't interfere with the election
Right.
business at all. They're just, and I love having people inside because watch what we're doing. You'll see we're doing it right, but we do get worried about the nefarious actors, so we want an ability to keep that out. Can you kind of dive into that?
Yeah.
How would
Well,
would anybody be able to exploit this, or would there be abilities to revoke certs or
yeah.
reject them if they're coming from nefarious actors?
So if they're coming from nefarious actors, number one, if they don't bother to go through the certification process, then there's absolutely clear that they have no right to be in the polling place. Okay. They're not an approved monitor. If they are going through the certification process, first and foremost, I see it as a positive because the certification process requires that they have to have a location, they have to have been active in the state for a minimum of a year. They have to have a physical location and a phone number. They have to have protecting the franchise, voters' rights, better elections in some way in their official documents. They have to identify who their officers are, who's responsible. And then they have to provide the Board of Elections with the training. They're required to give training to their monitors, to their volunteers, that, here's what you're allowed to do. Here's what election law permits in a polling place. This is what voters should expect. And it specifies that each volunteer has to sign a pledge that they won't interfere with the election, that they understand that they're nonpartisan, and that they will follow directions. And then when an organization is certified, they have to provide the county board of elections with a list of their volunteers who are going to be in polling places. And each volunteer has to wear an identifying badge of some kind that identifies the organization and the name of the person. And each volunteer has signed a pledge under penalty of perjury that they're going to behave themselves. And here's who they are and here's where they live. So if there are problems, you're not, who is this person? How do I find them? What do I do? You know who they are. And the voter knows. You know, there's nothing that stops a voter from asking an election protection volunteer, I'm confused. What are my rights? What can I do? How do I get some answers? If a voter approaches a monitor for election protection and says, I'd like some help, then that's fine. But the bill is very specific. You can't interfere. You have to be nonpartisan. If you are given a direction by a poll worker, it doesn't matter whether you agree or not. You have to do what they tell you. And if they tell you go in the corner and shut up, then you have to go in the corner and shut up. If they say there are too many of you in here, you're getting in the way, you have to go out, then those two have to go out. That's in the law. It's perfectly clear.
Right. We're still in control of the spots. And
that's right.
You know, just I want to put my full disclosure out there. I'm not endorsing any of these bills. We're just talking about them right now. The Democratic caucus hasn't decided to endorse, except for probably the funding. We'll endorse. I can go out on a limb there. It doesn't mean we're against it either. I just have to make sure I put that statement out there. Because I like doing this program to talk about potential legislation. But let's turn to litigation, because I think that's something that's a big change this year. That is being, you know, we have litigation going on redistricting. We have litigation going on but the big thing is the early voting by mail. I think that's the big thing that voters are asking about, are wondering about. The new law that was put in place to allow early voting by mail. There's litigation going on that, but assuming it will survive the litigation, and I believe it will, because I think it's well crafted. You know, I know that I've read over your proposals. A lot of that has to do about letting people know that this new option is out there. But why do you think that it is so important to introduce this mail option for early voting?
You know, there are a couple of things we've seen in various other jurisdictions that do help with turnout and that help with the voters' positive feeling about elections. Okay. So one of the things that we know does have an impact on turnout when you consolidate your elections into even years. We can talk about that another time. But we also know from our experience.
We've talked about it on this program a lot.
Yeah, you've had Jared, so I know you've talked about it a lot. But what we see, and we saw this in 2020, Dustin, you know this firsthand, that when people are given the option to be able to vote at home, vote by mail, that it just eases the pressure on their time. And you get a really significant response. You get more people who vote. You get a larger percentage of people who take advantage of this option. So that even though we have early voting, there are still people who are concerned about being able to get to a polling place, you know, end of October, November timeframe. In upstate New York, you get a crazy storm 7 days before the election and everything's bollocksed up, or you know, you have your elderly relatives and they don't see themselves as not being mobile, so they don't want an absentee ballot because they can't get to the polling place. Well, they can get to the polling place, but maybe it would be easier for you and your family if you didn't have to worry about driving them on an icy day. And so you have an opportunity to take more time with your ballot. Our ballots are longer. You get time to discuss it. You get time to research the candidates. It's easier to do that when you have your ballot in front of you and you know for sure who you're being asked to vote on, and you know which offices are up. You know if there's anything on the back of your ballot referenda that you want to research. And so it just makes the process more um, accessible for a lot of people who find that it takes a pressure off them, that they don't have to schedule when they're going to go vote, even though sometimes it's fun. I like to go vote with my husband, and we make a date and we go and we vote together. Um, it gives people options. And, I believe very, very strongly we are a government of, by, and for the people. Voting is our ability to choose our leaders. We trust people to choose our leaders. We can trust people to decide how they want to vote.
Well, we're kind of getting towards the end of the where I like to have that half hour of this program, and there's a lot of information, and you're going to come back on, I'm sure, before the end of the year, because when we get ramping up this early voting by mail in the general election,
Yep.
although it'll be available for the primaries, but when we're going to be ramping up, this program is going to be dedicated to making sure people know about all their options
Yep.
as well. But Susan, I like to end my program with my catch-all question of what haven't we talked about? What is and I'm sure we haven't talked about a lot. I mean, we've talked about a lot, but there's a lot of stuff going out there. But what is something that you want the voters to be left with? Maybe this would be thinking about whether it's legislation or something else.
I think it's mostly that this is yet another crucial election. 2024 is going to be a big deciding point for our country and our state. And, get ready. Be sure you and your family and friends are going to vote. Educate yourself, find out what's going on, stay tuned, and know that people like Dustin are working hard to be sure that your experience voting is a positive one. Know that our elections are well thought out, they're carefully monitored, they're secure, and they're fair. So come out and vote.
Excellent. Susan, thank you so much for all the work you do, for being a friend and a friend of democracy. And I look forward to working with you this year on all your goals and all our goals and the goals of the voters as well.
Absolutely. It's a good partnership, Dustin. Thanks for having me.
And that was my interview with Susan Lerner of Common Cause, a phenomenal advocate for voters in New York. It was a great interview, and I'm glad I finally got to get this out there. This next week, I plan on returning to the weekly walk. I'll be doing a look back at 2023 at dustinczarny.com and the year that was 2023 in my weekly walk this weekend. Next week, I will not be doing a Zoom with Czarny, but I will be doing a Czarny seminar about how to get on the ballot in 2024. And then my commissioner in the car next week will deal with the presidential primary, where everything stands for April 2nd, and whether there's any changes in the race since the New Hampshire primary. So check all that out. You can go to dustinczarny.com and subscribe. It's always free. I pay for it all myself. No ads, no outside money. It's all paid for by me as part of my public outreach and education to voters of Onondaga County and New York. Thank you very much and enjoy your day.